Can never whip these bugs if you don't keep you and them separate. I found that out in Birmingham. You've got to keep the white and the black separate.
All throughout history, black citizens had been facing segregation in many areas around the world. The 1800s brought serious changes for the integration of races in America with new reforms such as the Emancipation Proclamation and the rights to vote, but the most dramatic changes occurred in the Civil Rights era around 1950 and beyond. During this time, African Americans began standing up for their rights by becoming involved in riots, protests, and more. This movement began with integration in public areas around the country such as schools, restaurants, and transportation services. One of the main forms of transportation at the time was public buses, which was faced with bus segregation.
Bus segregation was a problem for a long time. Events that led to bus segregation becoming unconstitutional included the Montgomery bus boycott. This protest consisted of black citizens that refused to ride the city buses to protest segregated seating. 4 days after this protest, the Rosa Parks incident occurred when she was arrested because she refused to get out of a seat designated for a white person. There were many riots and protests against segregated buses, and people including Rosa Parks and Claudette Colvin were two women that contributed to the end of this issue. Bus segregation was officially declared unconstitutional in December of 1956 after the Morgan v. Virginia case. Although this brought the U.S. closer to ending segregation, their rights did not extend to the bus terminals. The Interstate Commerce Act ended segregation seating within the bus terminals. However, the restaurants, restrooms, etc. were still segregated between the blacks and whites, and this led to further issues.
The changes for segregation in the bus terminals was brought on mainly by the case of Boynton v. Virginia. Boynton v. Virginia focused on the story of Bruce Boynton, a black student at Howard University Law School in Washington, D.C., as he stopped in Richmond, Virginia on his way to Montgomery, Alabama from Washington, D.C. During a short stop in Richmond, Boynton decided to eat at a segregated restaurant. He sat on the white side of the restaurant and was asked to leave. He explained that he was an interstate passenger, but it was not enough, and it led to his arrest for trespassing. According to the California Law Review of the case, trespassing in Virginia was a misdemeanor, punishable with up to 30 days in jail and a $100 fine. The arrest was taken to court, and many worked hard in hopes of Boynton being found not guilty, like Thurgood Marshall, Boynton's attorney in the case.
The issue under debate during the Boynton v. Virginia case was the question of whether Boynton's arrest violated the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887. The Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 created the Interstate Commerce Commission, which regulated rules for transportation. Many people believe that under the Interstate Commerce Commission, black citizens had the right to sit in designated white areas in the terminals. However, others believed this not to be true and did not believe the act extended that far. The hopes for the case were that the bus terminals would be included in the coverage of the Interstate Commerce Act, which covered segregation in the actual buses. Boynton's arrest also followed the Morgan v. Virginia case that occurred in 1946 and ruled segregation on buses to be unconstitutional in the state of Virginia. Were bus terminals included?
While in court, Boynton pleaded not guilty to the charges, but according to the California Law Review of the case, after the testimony of the restaurant's assistant manager, the arresting officer, and the defendant, Boynton was found guilty by Judge Morris of Virginia. The outcome was not satisfactory for the community, so the case was taken to the Supreme Court. The hopes were that the Supreme Court could shed more light on the subject and sympathize with Boynton and the black community using public transportation. Their hopes were met when the Supreme Court deemed the case a violation of the Interstate Commerce Act of 1887 and found young Bruce Boynton to be not guilty.
This case was so dramatic for the black community because it was one of the first cases in which there was a strong push for the victory of an African American from a legal perspective. Boynton put his trust in the legal system, which was one of the less common but very impactful methods of creating a change within the African American community. His case showed a shift in views on segregation throughout the black and white legal community. After Boynton was found not guilty, there was an obvious beginning to the end of segregation, not only in the bus terminals, but within legal situations.
Not only did the Boynton v. Virginia case bring legal changes for the African American community, it pushed for even more social changes within the civil rights movement. According to Samuel Walker, an author of several civil rights books, Boynton became known as the first freedom rider because his case set the road for the famous freedom riders to create their movement. The Freedom Rides directly followed Boynton's case and began a protest as blacks and whites came together to ride various forms of transportation in the South to challenge the transportation segregation, which encouraged President John F. Kennedy to involve himself with the Commerce Commission and end segregation on public transportation for good. The Freedom Riders, and many others like Martin Luther King Jr., had the courage to stand up for themselves after the Boynton v. Virginia case because of the positive outcome that came from the case. Boynton brought on a domino effect of racial integration through his arrest.
Today, nearly all obvious forms of segregation, like segregation within public places, have been outlawed and are of nearly no issue, but African Americans and other minorities are still being segregated against within America from a social aspect. There is still segregation within the areas of living, as oftentimes there is little to no integration of races within communities. There is also still segregation within the workplace based on race, gender, and sexual orientation. However, there is much progress towards change, and the advocates all throughout the country are involving themselves in things like protests, just as was done during the civil rights movement. Ultimately, the Boynton v. Virginia case pushed for the end of bus terminal segregation and encouraged the movement of the Freedom Riders, thus leading to the end of racial segregation in the United States.